Welcome, everyone. Thank you guys for coming on this 8th of September post lunch. I hope everyone is full and ready for the insightful session that we have planned for everyone here. So officially kickstarting things. Welcome to the sixth edition of the Scaling Conversation series with X310X. At X310X, we make scaling easier for startup founders and leaders. Scaling success needs structural thinking, as many of you know already, right? It needs structural thinking on multiple fronts. One such front is leadership hiring. And in today's conversation, we want to break down this topic with an esteemed panel of speakers and also answer your queries on the topic. With this introduction, now it's time to introduce our first speaker and moderator, Abhijit Upadhyay, an industry veteran for over 2.5 decades, having run complex business operations and supply chain for companies like McDonald's worldwide. Prior to joining X310X, Abhijit, you were you joined here as a general manager, but you were also the CEO of Jeeves at Flipkart and went on to be the managing director at Tasty Bites, a BSE listed company. But apart from the work side of Abhijit, he's an avid nature lover, wildlife photographer, and a trained scuba diver. All very, very nice skills to add on your resume, Abhijit. Welcome, Abhijit. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Adi. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you once again for taking time out for discussing this exciting, interesting topic about leadership hiring, especially during today's time, which are quite uncertain, right? What I wanted to do before I introduce my fellow panelists was give you a couple of examples from my own career and more in the space and domain of leadership hiring, and then use that to set the context. So let's go back 16 years ago, 2007. I had just restarted my second stint at McDonald's India, and I was made to lead three very different and complex functions. And when I had joined, was the state of the union then? Number one, I felt completely out of depth in two out of three functions because neither I had the experience nor I had the expertise to lead those two functions. So that was the first thing. Second, while one of the functions was a 0 to 1 initiative where I was supposed to start a new business for McDonald's, the remaining two functions were obviously existing and were in deep trouble. They had issues going on for various years, because of which I was made to take the lead of these functions. And internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, super unhappy. And then obviously the environment for all the employees within that function was quite hostile. And the third, because of the hostile environment, you can imagine that there was hardly any talent left. Most of the incumbents had left the company from these functions because they couldn't handle the stress. And whoever was left back was either super unhappy, super stressed, and hence was not able to perform well. Now, this is the situation. Most of my time, because I was new, trying to understand the context of these functions, my time was being spent in this perfect storm where most of my time was in this urgent, important quadrant. And I realized that the only way out for me was hire the best talent for each of these three functions under me. And while I had no time, 24/7 working towards addressing the day-to-day priorities, I had to take away time to focus on this important activity, which is leadership hiring. Within 3 months, I was able to fill all the three positions. One guy came in through an external search firm and headed the supply chain function for me. The other person was an incumbent in my department, and she had all the intrinsics. So I felt she was the right person to take charge of that department. And the third, where I was doing the 0 to 1 initiative, I realized that it was best to look at an internal hire. So I looked at other departments and found one strong operations lead who came in and started leading that 0 to 1 initiative for me. Within 3 months, I was able to then find three leaders for each of the three functions which I was expected to lead. Also, what I found was that the initial 2 months, while there was day-to-day issues which I had to still manage, they required hand-holding and induction time, which I had to give. I could not ask them to directly jump because it would have created more chaos for them. So I spent a lot of time in helping them induct and get trained in what they were supposed to be doing. 4 years later, 2011, I was fortunate to have got an opportunity to go abroad for a global stint at McDonald's. And my boss then asked me a simple question: Abhijit, if you go, what happens to your department? And I was like, don't worry, the 3 leaders that I have groomed over the past couple of years are more than responsible for taking care of taking direct charge of the departments. You don't need to replace me at all. Save your GNA. And these 3 leaders took direct charge, started reporting to my boss. Today, one of them is a chief supply chain officer for a global retail company. The other person leads R&D function globally for a very large international QSR chain. And the third person has become a CEO of an upcoming QSR chain. Now you can imagine the power that and joy that I had when I hired the right leaders. But guys, this is always not a happy story. I have many unhappy stories as well. And let me share just one more before I invite my fellow panelists. So the other example, again, not so happy an example, is from my Tasty Bite days. So like Adi mentioned, I was the managing director of this publicly listed company. The business had become quite complex. We had a very large manufacturing facility, about 1,500 workers coming in every day. We were exporting to 17 plus countries, had a B2C business as well as a B2B business. And the growth charter that we had lined up for the next 2 years was quite complex. And we had to do an org design exercise. When I did the org design exercise, we realized that given the complexity that we had come into, there was a need for finding a good planning head who would take charge of the entire sales and operations process. Again, deployed a good exec search firm, found an excellent planning head, at least that's what we felt. He came in with the right pedigree. Came in from Nitty, had almost 12 to 15 years of experience, worked with companies like Unilever, Colgate, FMCG companies in the planning function. 6 months into his stint, our S&OP process was more broken than it was before. Our customer satisfaction levels had dipped like crazy. I had missed 2 quarters of my sales and profitability numbers. And when I looked at what's in the pipeline from an inventory perspective, I realized that I'm going to be having tough time to meet the next 3 quarters of my numbers as well. Something had gone terribly wrong with this hire, so I had to immediately ask him to let him go. Now, what went wrong when I look back? It was culture, complete culture misfit. And we realized there was a huge problem. He's always been an individual contributor, but people collaboration skills were very, very poor. Now, with these 2 examples, what I wanted to just talk about was, what is it that I'm trying to get to? That leadership hiring or finding the right leaders is a huge superpower for a company. And if used well, and if it works in your favor, can not just do a 10x, but do a 100x for your company as well. Like I found with my 3 right leaders that I hired. However, if something goes wrong, it can set your company back by months, if not years, right? So the real question that I want to pose for all of us is there a method to this madness? Can we in some way improve the odds of hiring the right person? And to answer this question and many more, I would love to introduce 2 of my fellow panelists who come in with decades of experience in this domain and space. So let me first get Anil Chandra. Anil has about 20 years of experience in the talent space. His passion, as he says, is finding and hiring the right talent. His last 2 stints were with a company called ThoughtSpot, where he led talent acquisition globally for the R&D function, and also for Asia Pacific, led all the hires for many more functions. He also was a talent head for InMobi, and prior to that has worked with Flipkart, Ola. He is currently on his journey to become an entrepreneur with a company called CoBuilder, and along with his co-founder, he is looking to start a venture studio and build companies in India. Welcome, Anil. A pleasure to have you on board.
Hey, thanks, Abhijit. Thank you for having me on this.
Now, let me introduce my other participants and a very close friend, Praveen Nair. Praveen, another veteran with more than 20 years of experience in the leadership hiring space. He started his career with his own consulting firm in exec search, went on to when the startup ecosystem in India was just developing. He led talent acquisition for Flipkart and then moved on to do talent acquisition for companies like Ola, Bounce, Meesho, and all of this during their hyper growth phase. Today, Praveen leads the hiring practice for X210X. At X210X, we have a hiring practice where we help recruit L1 leaders for startups. And it's a pleasure, Praveen and Anil, to have you both on this webinar.
Thank you, Abhijit. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So you guys heard the two examples that I gave, right? One was a powerful example where hiring the right leader helped me immensely. And the second one where it really changed my odds of success in a worst manner by putting me back almost 6 to 9 months. So given your experience, and I'm sure you guys have got many more such examples given your vast experience, let me ask you guys the first question and open up this webinar. In your experience over the past decade or so, how has leadership hiring as a subject and as a practice evolved? And what are the new processes, differentiators that you feel employers and recruiters have had to introduce to make this still a relevant topic and make it more successful? Anil, maybe I'll start with you, and then Praveen, you can add on.
Absolutely. I think it's a great question to start off. Leadership hiring, right? And it's a very critical hire. I think you get it right or not. It defines the roadmap and the path of building a company truly. Look, I think fundamentally the qualities of what we look for in a leader hasn't changed much, right? You still need somebody with a clear vision. You need somebody who can articulate that vision, inspire people, brings in a certain authentic self, being transparent. All of that are traits that we look for. But I think there's been a bunch of things that have changed, at least in the last 10 years, and some very interesting changes, right? So I can speak from a startup lens more than from an enterprise. The fact that I think the focus is heavy. The focus has kind of shifted from being just skill centric to being more, or just pedigree, to being more competency driven and more person oriented. And kind of talk more about that as we go. So it's no longer here's a role, here's a person, let's match that and see if that works. But it's been more person specific, because I think what biggest changes happened is versus functional skills, the soft skills which are harder to assess is something that most companies are working on. The second, I think, is looking for leaders who are more agile and adaptable. If anything, the last 2 years or 3 years have taught us is folks, who are rigid and not being able to move have kind of lost their way through the pandemic. And that's shown up in companies that have either thrived or not done well, right? Leadership roles show up very quickly. And so, we're now looking at folks who are doing more, it's more breadth versus depth. For example, if there's a CMO who was tasked with just branding and let's say performance marketing as a latest ad, today is asked to kind of contribute to product, is kind of asked to contribute to sales and make sure marketing qualified leads are better than sales qualified leads. That kind of a mindset is what I think is happening, and is a change in the way that leadership hiring is looked at. So it's more person dependent. And the third and final one is I think we're ready to experiment, which wasn't the case earlier with leadership. For example, if you even within the HR domain, if you look at the industry today, we have HR leaders who are not from core HR backgrounds, right? You have folks from sales, you have folks from engineering, and that should tell us that it's more about the person. Some of these functional skills can be trained and acquired, but I think the softer side of leadership attributes, those are tougher skills. I think there's a huge emphasis on that now, more than ever before, in my view. Yeah. So those are three things that I think is. Yeah.
Some great points, Anil. Competencies over just pure pedigree or resume. Right. Having leaders who are agile, adaptable, given the kind of VUCA environment that all of us are operating under. And third is ability to experiment both at a founder CEO level as well as at a functional level, finding people who may or may not have the experience for that function, but you experiment with people given that they possibly have the same competencies. Praveen, your thoughts on this?
So very, very well said by my colleague, my ex-colleague. It talks very clearly about how people actually bring in the more important aspect and the ability to adapt and be agile in a scenario where they are able to perform better. And we've seen that examples play out in many cases. Like, for example, Anil will agree, in Flipkart, we never had a core HR person as the HR leader, right? We've always had a functional leader take on the responsibility as an HR leader. And similarly, in many such examples, we we've seen in the recent past. And I think what has also happened over the past 3-4 years with complex business scenario developing with pandemic behind us, it's also gone to a place where a much better clarity in terms of the role needs to be defined by the person who's going to be coming in to perform that role has become paramount in terms of the importance in that, right? So yeah, I mean, all of that has started playing out very well in the leadership hiring space.
It just takes me to one more example, guys, from my previous experience, where Anil, like you just talked about, it's more about competencies and maybe recruiting a person who may or may not have done that function ever at all, right? So again, in one of my companies, I was struggling with the materials function, and it was a place where we had a lot of issues going on, and there was a bright young graduate that we had recruited directly from campus, who came in with a quality function background, but had such strong competencies on problem solving, on 0 to 1 initiatives, that he went on to quickly become manufacturing expert. And when this function was in trouble, I just told him that, hey, come out of this function and take charge of this. It was to a large extent for the entire company. It felt like a demotion for him because it was a very small function compared to manufacturing. But I knew that if there was one person that I could help solve this current crisis, was this guy. He took on this responsibility. Within 6 months, got this function unbelievably towards its right capability and competency. And again, moved on to now head a manufacturing function for 4 large factories for another food processing company. But just time and again proves that our old ways of looking at the resume, X number of years of experience coming in from this campus, that company, may or may not necessarily work. Any examples, guys, where you feel things have gone wrong and possibly horribly wrong, and any learnings out of those? I gave an example where I felt things went quite bad for me, but any examples from your past experience? And before that, Adi, maybe we can just pose this question to the audience, get a poll and view from them, and then I would love to hear back from Anil and Praveen on this one. So guys, if you can just quickly look at the question on your screen and choose what you think is the most challenging part for your process.
Yeah, Anil, if you can go with your example, then I'll.
Certainly. Look, I think I'm just raking my brains, when you hire for 20 plus years, more often than not, if somebody says I've got it all right, I'll kind of raise my eyebrow a bit. But there are times when you don't get it right and you learn from them. I think one of the examples that I want to kind of talk about is kind of role agnostic, is kind of team agnostic. I think is a challenge that most startups go with, and I've been with a few of them that you made this mistake as well. It kind of slightly overlaps with what Abhijit spoke about, but it's got a slight nuance to it. I think in a startup, we want folks who can move fast, build things, scale teams. You build, you scale, you kind of grow, all of that, right? One of the most common places to look for, and you want this person, when you think of building teams, you want this person who's come in with a certain credibility of doing this somewhere else. And most often than not, we fall into this whole trap of getting somebody from a large enterprise or an MNC, which there's no right or wrong with these things. They typically come from a more structured background, system oriented. Decision making is more hierarchical, and it kind of gets vetted or vetoed depending on it. So one of these startups, it was a head of engineering that we hired who came in from such a background to scale a startup, right? We were still early stage, which meant that there was a lot of chaos and ambiguity and uncertainty. And he was a person with that structured thinking thrown into this problem. Sooner than later, and this person came with all the right references and all of it, right? So, but I think sooner than later, we saw that, not necessarily coming from a certain company, coming from a certain background, coming from all of that is a direct match. When we did an RCA, actually, it was a bad hire, head of engineering. It had its impact on the team. It had, the person had brought in their own referrals. You see, the consequences of getting this wrong was so high. Now, suddenly, instead of building and growing fast, it kind of took us back by a few months. But like most startups do, and we did an RCA of what did we do wrong. While we got swayed by all of those things, we also realized that we didn't have the hiring framework right for this leadership. Here's what happened, right? You get a resume and you say, "Yeah, jaake baat kar lo isse, bas." That's it, right? And you don't know. There's no outline to what the person has to cover. 5 of them, a lot of redundancy in the process. We didn't walk away with enough data points to make an actual informed decision. Truly, that's what happened, right? And so we changed that approach, right, from the JDs to what the competency was mapped out, what each person will speak about, probably getting written feedback. And that was a missing factor. In startup, you're running so hard, you're hustling so hard. And I'm sure folks here would realize, kind of concur with me, is the fact that it's very hard to get written feedback. I've had people send me feedback over WhatsApp and saying, and it was hire, yes, no kind, right? So from there to doing a tight debrief was something that we absolutely had mandatory for the next role. That was one example that came by that, that we thought somebody who'd done this, been there, done that, could easily translate to building startups. Is not necessarily the case. And you won't believe the next person we hired for that role was a lot younger. And Abhijit, that's exactly why I said it'll be an overlap. Probably not a fresher out of college and stuff, but I think somebody fairly junior, but had the right competencies, and we ended up building a business that scaled over 40 million eventually. So that's a learning that comes to mind of not having a more structured process in the name of agility and speed. We lost out on quality a bit. Yeah.
Before I ask Praveen to respond, Adi, do you have the results from the, yeah, okay. So I think the top 2 challenges is manager expectations to be managed right, and then followed by finding the relevant candidates. So really it's about the long drawn hiring process and the right JD come a close second, along with getting the right candidate to join after the entire process. So Praveen, this brings me to your reflections on this, and how can a proper framework or a process help address some of these challenges? As you can see, if the expectation of the hiring manager is not clear, a lot of these processes that are being talked about will just fall apart, because there's no strong, solid foundation on what does the manager require, and who does he really want, and why does he want that person. So your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I so resonate with what Anil talked about in terms of his experience and the experiences that I've also gone through working with startups over the last 8 years, and how that has evolved in terms of the leadership hiring, right? Sometimes it is important for businesses to take a step back, right? And reflect on, and that's where the hiring framework comes into play. And I think that's where we've also been propagating a hiring framework to our clients, right? That it's very important to pay attention to those core tenets of hiring, and not look at it only as a sort of a transaction, right? But rather paying importance to each part of the what we call as the temple of hiring, right? And I'm just going to put up a small slide to talk about that framework, Abhijit and Anil, with your permission.
Yes, sure. Please. I mean, I would love to see the frameworks that the participants can.
So like how Anil discussed, it's so very important for the communication process both ways to form a seamless interaction, right? Where the whole process of getting the job description right, understanding the role right, which is again sitting below the talent philosophy of the company. And why are we trying to hire that role? What is in that role for the incumbent? How does that role play out in the future? Having all of that defined with criteria around where do we source from, how do we assess the right fitment for that particular role, and then not to forget that after you complete the entire process, debate about what has been the right part of the process and the candidate before you actually try and close, and then also measure this entire process through a part of candidate experience scores to make sure that both at the hiring scale, in terms of the caliber of the talent that you're hiring, as well as the experience that you've offered to the candidates, has been met from all angles, right? And that then brings about the best practices of a recruiting community per se, right? And I think this tenet cannot be emphasized less, because like Anil says, it's very important to have that data insights before you actually make that decision. I can give you an example, Abhijit, about one of my small projects that we did in the company that we both, in fact, work with. And Anil can vouch for how difficult it was to hire for that company that we worked. I wouldn't name that company at this point, but at least in one space where we got that right is because we realized that the company had different businesses, right? And when we were hiring for a functional expertise across those business lines, what we did was we figured out what stage each business was, and therefore what kind of a person should have come in to head that particular function in those businesses. And when we got that right, we actually had, I mean, looking back at it, inadvertently planned succession. Making sure that we had one company cover the other, and there was a clear line of ladder of succession that was possible for people to come in. I'm talking about the marketing function that we were trying to hire for that company across different business lines. And we hired together about 4 or 5 leaders at one point, using various data points that we had based on our interactions with different candidates during the hiring process. So it's very important to make sure that these frameworks are taken care of and these frameworks are adhered to.
So Praveen, let me put you on the spot and ask you something. While I've been a part of the hiring practice at X210X, this is the first time I've crossed to the other side. I've always been working with recruiters like you and helping. Can you just put up the temple for a minute, Adi? I just want to use the same framework and put Praveen on the spot.
Go for it.
So Praveen, my question to you is, when I look at what's mentioned on this temple here, it is no different than I Google on best practices for hiring. I will find exactly the same response, right? It will show me exactly the same process. So why is it that your framework and what you do and the way you are working, either with the previous companies that you've been a part of, or now that you're hiring with X210X for other companies, what's changed in each of these, or at least in some of these, which help me understand that the chances and odds of success are definitely going to get better?
So Abhijit, for example, I'm sure Anil will agree here that recruiting is not a rocket science for any one of us, right? I mean, it's a very simple process per se, but unless you think of it from a very methodical standpoint, right, you tend to start compromising on one part of it. And that's why probably you see perception wise also this whole participant community also talked about how managing hiring manager experience is paramount, right? Because that's very important. That's the reason why you're doing this, right? And at the same time, that you're in a market where candidate pool is limited, the supply pool of talented folks is limited, and you're trying to vie for the best of the talent, right? Younger talent, better talent, adaptable talent, flexible talent, and so on. But unless you start to reflect on how you are building the whole process, I think you will tend to run into a problem area, is what we've seen time and again. In each of your examples, I'm sure if you were to reflect on those examples, you would see that. Now, what I mean is, say, for example, if you're building the competency for that role, it will also have to have some part of, your own talent philosophy overcovering that, right? And therefore, you will have to think about how you're building your JD, how you're building about individual attributes that are required for the role. What kind of a strategy are you using? I mean, many a times leadership hiring, like we all know, most times it happens through references. But certain roles, you might need to have market insights, for which you might need to have a search partner involved. It might not be that you will hire a person from the search partner. Maybe you will still hire a person internally, but you will have enough data points to calibrate against the people that you've met. And you would have thought about what would make sense for that particular role before you actually arrive at that decision, right? Similarly, it will give you enough understanding about what sort of a offer reward would actually make sense for that particular role, because all that will come into play once you have started building this whole process up, right? So I think, Abhijit, it's important that while the process is simple, the process is known for everybody, the practices are known for everybody, there has to be a sort of a framework. And I think that's where our stand would be, that, it is always better to reflect and build the whole system and guideline framework better before you embark on that journey.
Got it. I think 2 points which you mentioned, I can definitely see where I have seen a huge change between what was done before and what is done now. Where number one is Anil had talked about this from a competency perspective. Earlier, when I would look at a JD of a candidate, it would be needs X years of experience in this kind of domain, this kind of industry, needs to come in from this pedigree, blah, blah, blah. And that's about it, right? Now, when I look at the JDs, which are 10 on 10, they will have this, but that will only be 25% of the JD. It will have the competencies for the role. It will have the expectations from the role. So the competencies could be, he needs to be a problem solver. He needs to be thinking like a founder. He needs to have collaboration mindset. And there are clear indications on how the competencies should be tested. So that's one big difference that I'm seeing, at least in the way JDs are being written and the right JDs are being written. Second, I'm seeing, to your point, the whole sourcing piece, Praveen, where it is not necessarily going to the typical profiles that you see, but also now starting to look at, are there internal candidates which can actually help us get to the same outcome? And the third, I believe, which is equally more important, is in the past, it was a boss who was deciding who should be hired. Now there are panels. Sometimes you have not just your peers, your direct report is also interviewing your bosses, and a structured debrief panel, again, which is what you mentioned, Anil, in the beginning, that a written feedback, which is deep rooted in competencies, and only then clear decisions being taken, right? So I think I can see why this framework is possibly having the same tenets, but the insides of the framework have completely changed. Now, I just want to quickly shift gears, Praveen and Anil, and talk about one more important topic. Again, it comes from my experience at working with companies which possibly didn't have a great branding. Flipkart was a great brand. People would love to come and work for Flipkart, right? But when I was working for Jeeves, though it was a Flipkart company, I was finding it hard to attract talent over there. So this brings me to this point of, today's world is very different than 10 years back, where I was just happy that somebody was giving me a job. Today's employees are almost at the same bargaining level as an employer. They choose which company to join, especially the good ones. So what's the role of employer branding, and how does one go about doing this? Anil, your thoughts?
Sure, absolutely. There's a very famous quote that comes to mind: whoever tells the story the best wins, right? So employer branding is more like that for me. But having said that, I've been fortunate, I should say. I've worked with startups with no names, with some names that you wouldn't have remembered or kind of doesn't cross. So the learnings that came from there were very clear, right? So especially at leadership levels, we'll talk about two cohorts of employer branding. There's leadership hiring, and then there is all of the volume hiring that we do. Leadership hiring is such a personalized search. It's very high touch, white glove, and you need to share a lot more about the business and know the business inside out before you can even approach anyone, right? I think that's what employer branding does for me, right? The two biggest thing that it should do, in my mind, employer branding, is to reduce hiring costs. By that, either you hire from outside or you retain the people with enough information about the company. Second is you ease the hiring process out, right? Candidates come in knowing about the company. For me, the startups that I worked with where the names were not that popular, if somebody walked in knowing 2 out of 10 things, for me, that was a big win, because then you have a starting point, you have a stepping stone to then engage that candidate further. Now, if that was 6 or 7, it would have made my life so much more easier, right? And that's where I meant ease the hiring process with the amount of information that you're able to give out. It could possibly accelerate referrals as well, right? So for me, employer branding is a no-brainer. Is it important? Absolutely it is. Do we need to do it? Yes, we do. But if you're thinking of early stage startups, then it's a lot of in-person storytelling over a lot of coffees or over a lot of conversations. But as you scale, I think it becomes then important to understand, why are you doing this? Who's the audience, right? Are you doing to hire? Are you doing to kind of retain? What are you trying to do, right? And one of the biggest wins that I've seen, and companies that have got this right, I can think of, is Apple and Nike, for example, right? No matter where in the world you go in, all their shops look and feel the same. And for me, that's like a benchmark of what employer branding can do well. So I've two things: leadership, a high touch point, white glove treatment, requires a lot of in-person, but still I think we can go out there, speak about the culture, and Praveen, we spoke about this example. There's no right or wrong with these things. There's a company that is referring to said, we're highly ambitious, we're hardworking, We do 6-day weeks. If you don't want to work here, perfectly all right. But that's their culture, perfectly all right. But it's important for us to talk about it more openly. There's an example that comes to mind. One of the startups, this was Tabzo, Help Chat. And one of the things that we did was we actually...
Are we losing Anil?
Did I lose you? Did I lose you or...
I mean, we didn't lose you, but yes, there was a break. Let's give Anil a couple of seconds. Otherwise, Praveen, I'll...
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So one of the things that we did at this company called Help Chat, or Tabzo as it was called later on, was we actually wrote out a culture document. There were a set of 34 questions, which we gave every single candidate, telling them who we were, right? It became like a proxy for us that here's where we are. We're an early stage startup. We're working hard. We're doing this, yeah, and what to expect. And it was no right or wrong with those things. We said, use it as a mirror for your own reflection. And that's what employer branding is for me, right? Sometimes you sign up for things without knowing, and that's where I think it backfires. If you walk into something that you already know enough about and you sign up, it becomes easier. That 34 questionnaire still resonates. And a lot of them walked away from the table, which was perfectly all right, because otherwise we would have had to get into a situation of having to rehire and stuff. And so employer branding, culture, all of that is, there are different ways and means of doing it. But, I think as long as it can help reduce hiring costs and ease the hiring process, we should think about it. Typically, marketing plays a huge role in this, and TA and HR marketing should come in. I think marketing brings in all of the guidelines and all of what the company does. The people side of things is what I think we should bring into the picture. It's not easy. It's definitely not easy. It's a challenge when you build out an employer branding program. But I think, is it worth the effort? Absolutely, no brainer. Yeah.
Sure. Praveen, from your experience, and especially while we are at X to 10X, we are hiring for many companies, and some of them not necessarily known names like the Flipkarts and the Meeshos of the world that you've worked in the past. What would be your advice to companies who are hiring senior leaders, don't want to compromise on the quality of the candidates, rightly so, but not necessarily have a name in the market? How do you go about building that?
Yeah, so Vijit, again, going back on my conversation, starting from where I left on the framework, right? Employer branding is what you are communicating to the talent market in terms of what your philosophy is, what you stand for, and what's your shared vision in where you're taking the company. Now, many a times it's not just like what you do in terms of just a LinkedIn post or what you put out on your career website, but it is also what you're showcasing in even your job description, or even when an interviewer is talking to a candidate, when your first pitch conversation happens from the hiring manager in the pitch interview with a candidate, right? Similarly, and in many cases, we work with very young startups, right? Abhijit, we work with startups who are just about building and making a product market fit. At that point of time, we become the ambassadors to do the same thing. This is what becomes paramount to us, because we spend a lot of time figuring out with these candidates whether they do align to the culture of the founder's vision and whether they will want to work in a company like that. Some companies are on the face, right? Like Anil says, no, not all companies are 5 days working, flexible work-life balance, work from home and stuff, right? But there are companies which want grunt work initially, maybe hustle work initially, and maybe you reap benefits of it later on. But that communication becomes a part of that framework again, which cannot be not mentioned. Now you see all the times JDs being put out in the market which says generic stuff, and that's where it becomes very important, right?
So what I'm hearing from both of you is, as like for any new brand, every touch point of the consumer experience matters to build the brand. In a similar way, when you're looking at hiring somebody, every touch point that the candidate goes through, right from the way the JD is written, the way the LinkedIn ads are being written, to the interview, the way it's conducted, and especially possibly the founder playing a very larger than life role, selling his vision, because at this stage, there is not much to sell except the vision. Exactly. And that are the ways in which you can actually start in building your brand, both as a founder as well as your company. And then as it gets bigger, then obviously spend very clear, it's not just towards performance marketing for driving business for consumers, but equally doing it the same way for your driving in employees, both from a retention as well as from an acquisition perspective as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I
Last
think
question.
actually the
Sorry.
biggest thing, just one last one, the biggest thing, and one of the things that we've learned the hard way is just stay authentic, because there's so many touch points, right? You're going to talk to 8 panel members, you're talking to a recruiter, you're talking to a coordinator, you're talking to someone else, you're talking to external people. I think it's so important to just stay authentic and consistent. Otherwise, you're going to hear these, different forms and shapes of different stories. And that's where it gets confusing, I would say. So just stay authentic. If someone has to sign up, they will. It's better for them to know what they're signing up for. So yeah.
And who better than to talk about this experience than Abhijit himself? I remember Abhijit when he interviewed at Flipkart, and I was fortunately the leadership recruiter at that point. Uh, I can ask him how many touch points he had in terms of his interview during those days,
True. Completely aligned. We've got a couple of minutes before I would love the participants who are waiting to ask us questions. But last question, and maybe a shorter answer from the two of you. What's the role that an external recruiter plays in a leadership hiring space? Most companies want to save costs and hence have internal TA teams. And what's the right or wrong between doing things completely internally versus getting some external partner who's possibly a specialist in this space? I'll let Praveen go first.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Anil's been on the other side of the table. So let me answer this question first, and then maybe I'll take Anil's inputs there too. So I think, Abhijit, like we've been saying so far, it is established that leadership hiring has a big cost to it, right? And you cannot afford a misfit or a hiring, a mishire in that sense, right? And therefore, any company or any founder or any position that you're trying to fulfill should look at paramount the reason for the fulfillment of it rather than where it comes from, right? Now, external partners can give you the sense of the market, can give you an outside-in view of what's available, what people are talking about you, what's people understanding about the company, and help in terms of pitching many a times, make it easier in terms of the process than what an internal company can generally do, right? And in X210's case, you and me know, Abhijit, that since we have many other engagements with the clients, we are in a much better space to create a sort of a credible conversation between the candidate as well as the hiring manager in terms of the opportunity and what lies for the candidate in terms of his or her future. So I think it cannot be mentioned less in terms of what an external partner brings to the table. It is how you leverage it. It does not mean that you cannot look at candidates from other spaces. You might want to use the external partner to collaborate and make sure that you bring the right fit into the market, right fit into your company, rather than just looking at what's available within our given handful space of work that we can pick people from. Over to you, Anil.
Quick response to it, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Yeah. Very quickly, there are 4 vectors, right? Either you look at time, speed, quality, or cost. Time, speed, quality, or cost. Most often, the focus is on cost. But I can tell you after 20 years of hiring that when you get the right person in who can deliver and build, cost is often forgotten, right? Nobody asks you where that candidate came from, how did that person come from, and who referred, all of it, right? So I think just use judgment in what's right, what can help the business scale. The opportunity cost of not hiring somebody is very high. And if that person has to come from an external firm, so be it. If it's internal, so be it. But I think the business has to move very quickly. And like I said, most often cost is forgotten when you get the right person in. So yeah.
Super. Thanks, Anil, Praveen. I think great insights into the entire framework, the way it's changing. Adi, can we now go to the questions that people have put in the panel and get them to be answered?
Sure. Thanks for the insightful session, folks. I wish we could continue more. Just didn't want you guys to end, but we'll start with the questions. We have an anonymous question around when the industry we are hiring is rather niche and the company wants to hire only from the same industry stalwarts. How do we convince hiring managers to open their minds to looking at other possibilities?
Praveen, you want to talk about this?
I think Anil is better in a position because he's been one R&D engineering hiring leader and he's done marvelous work in that space. So niche hiring is very, very core to what Anil stands for. So Anil, why don't you?
Anil, go ahead.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's a tough one. It's not easy, but there are a couple of ways that you can go about doing this, right? One of the things that I often look when when I talk to recruiters and hire for my own team is the ability to understand business deeply enough, right? Not just to talk about high level company and values and things, but businesses deeply enough. Hiring managers respect recruiters who understand the business nuances, not just high level, but nuances. If you can do that, coupled with the fact that when you get candidates from outside of the industry that your hiring manager wants, with enough data points, by that I mean, think of an executive search firm, right? I don't know if you've worked with one, if whoever has asked this question, but if you haven't, every time you work with one, there's a one-page document that comes on why this candidate should be considered. If you can take such an approach, it may not work the first time, it may not work the second time, but the third time, I can assure you that a manager who sees this is going to say, hey, listen, man, this person is putting in so much time and effort to give me these data points to make an informed decision. That's, I think, going to be the door that will open, to try candidates from other industries. And so I think understanding the business nuances, coupled with the fact that if you can provide enough information to make an informed decision, it could be a one page, it's a lot time consuming and effort, but if you can do that, it's going to help them open up other possibilities as well.
I'll just add to what you're saying, Anil. If it's a very niche industry and requires subject matter expertise, which is deep technical, then possibly you have to really spend time in finding the right candidate within that same domain. But if there are functions in the industry where you can actually go broad, then you should definitely try and do that and use examples of many other places where things such like this have worked. Like if you're in a satellite kind of an industry, getting somebody from a different domain will backfire. So you require for that expertise somebody from that specific industry only. But if you're hiring for a marketing function, you may or may not require it from the same domain, right? So that's just to add to what you just rightly said. Adi, the next question, please.
Yeah, maybe the next question also, Anil, I think you can take, which is, what is the level of AI adoption in HR processes across Indian ecosystem, including MNCs? What is the impact and trend that you see?
Oh man, this is such an important question to ask, and I think we've been a lot more receptive to it over the last 3 years now. We've been remote, working out of different corners. Someone's working out of Bathinda, someone's working out of Kochi, and someone from Bangalore. Working all on the systems that brings us together. I'll take one example. If you look at diversity right now, there's such an emphasis on diversity, getting it right from JDs to all communication, that AI is making a huge dent in the way JDs are getting written. That is more inclusive in nature rather than just a must-have, right? There are tools that are doing that. There are tools that are now talking about surveys and getting a pulse of the organization, right? It's a huge one, especially when we are working remote. How can we make that happen? Making sure that we understand, where each employee is. So these are just two examples that come to mind. There's a ton of other things, but overall, I think the energy that's going behind adopting this and accepting it, I think is fairly high. Let's say if we spoke about 2019 to 2023, I think it's significantly high right now. There's so much more. I think you should play around with a bit. For example, I was talking on this call, I'm using something called Crisp.ai to actually blur all of the background noise, right? I think we've been on Zoom for so long that I found this just 3 months back. I should have done this a lot sooner. So it's actually coming to our day-to-day life, and so there's no other way but to kind of adapt to it at some point. Yeah, I would say go ahead and experiment. You'll love it.
Thanks, Anil. Quick question for you, Praveen, which is, you showed us the Temple of Hiring framework. Any quick thoughts on how is it different?
So I was saying, Adi, that it is not different. It is not different in the sense that the practice remains what some of the steps that we usually follow, but it is the importance of putting all of that together in that framework, which goes one after the other, right? So, for example, I can't emphasize enough about how the JD needs to carry parts of your talent philosophy, and how the interviewing process needs to be part of your talent philosophy too, and how that communication passes from one step to the other, and each of those steps becoming, a path to the whole process. It also means that, you cannot just do those processes and not measure the impact of it and see what is working for you. And how do you bring about data from each of those steps to make your process better, to make it count for you and have the right hiring impacts for yourself, right? So in that sense, I thought that the framework encompasses the entire process in its entirety.
I think what I would add, Adi, is I think the whole
Cool.
concept
Next
of
question. There's a constant battle between hiring manager and HR with respect to TAT and the leadership hiring process. What can be a good time to commit considering the position has been open for more than 6 months before it has come to you?
I lost
Yeah,
him.
you'd like to go, Arul? Yeah.
I lost him for a bit there, I think. So I didn't hear the full question.
I'll quickly repeat for you, Anil. So I think the question is more around the battle between hiring manager and HR with respect to TAT in leadership hiring. And
Right.
what should be a good time frame to commit considering the position has been open for some months before it came to the hiring person? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, look, I think we are in an age where we exactly know where candidates are. It's no longer a sourcing battle right now, right? Which leads us to taking a very data-driven approach on this. Like I'll give you an example. If you today have to look for front-end director, front-end engineering, there are only about 150 guys who will probably qualify for that all over India because front-end is just about 7 or 8 years. I'm just taking this example in engineering. You could do something similar, but it's about 7-8 years old right now. Now, this is the data set that we know exists today, right? Which means that if you have to crack this role, here are the 150 or 200 people that we can go after. How do we better engage them now? For me, the constant battle has been to take this data to the hiring manager. Otherwise, there's always this thought in mind that there's someone else that we don't have. If they don't see a superset of data, they always assume that there's more than what's coming their way, right? So for me, a data-driven approach there and a collaborative one, right? I've had recruiters in the team, and I've done this myself, is to sit with a hiring manager on LinkedIn, for example. And if he or she needs this on this team, is just as critical for that person to be able to walk them through this search itself, right? So I think it's more data driven for me than anything else, which kind of bridges the gap between the expectation and the reality. And then you work towards the next tactical steps of, communication and reach outs and all of those conversations. That kind of sets the tone for the TAT. If the superset is small, then it's going to take much longer versus otherwise. I hope that answers your question, but yeah. Praveen, Abhijit, anything else to add to that? Happy to hear your thoughts.
No, I think what you're saying absolutely makes sense, Anil. And also the fact that, when hiring managers talk about, hey, this role has been open for such a long time, I think at that point of time, a recruiting team usually takes the blame saying, hey, we've not been able to fulfill. I think that battle does not lie with the recruiting team. That battle actually lies with the hiring team. And I'm sure, Abhijit, like you yourself started the conversation this time with us, saying that the role requirement is actually a leader's requirement. It's a hiring manager's requirement to make sure that the role is filled in, right? So if a role is not filled in for a very long time, that means that probably the role never had its existence in place at the first place. So maybe you need to question that. If a role is open and if you are unable to close the role in a given time frame, and that's when I think Anil's conversation about making sure that the data is shown and sat down with the hiring manager to be explained and to take them through the historical empirical evidence of how many candidates were considered, etc., will come into play. But if a conversation starts with the hiring manager saying that, hey, this role has been open for time immemorial, I think that time immemorial actually lies with the hiring manager themselves, right?
Yeah.
The only point that I would like to add to this is, I think as functional managers and leaders and founders who are hiring, we need to stop blaming possibly the TA and the HR folks if we are not clear about who we are hiring, why we are hiring, and we don't give enough time for the hiring process. Having been on the other side, knowing the issues of not having a good leader in place, we have to really disproportionately devote time for the process to get it completed on time. If you're not getting the right sourcing done, let's first question whether we've written the JD correctly or not. If we've written the JD correctly and we are still not getting the right inputs, then absolutely go back to your search firm, to your TA leaders. Then I'm just not getting what I'm looking at. Are there others that we can look for? But we have to first look internally if we are a business leader for the hiring process, and then absolutely partner very closely with HR, TA, and the exec search firm to get our requirements met.
Yeah. I often question if someone's had a role open for 3 months, do they really need it or not?
Exactly.
Right? So,
exactly.
It's on the hiring manager just as much as it's on TA or HR. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Folks, I know there are a lot of very, very good questions lined up, and we'll try to, answer as many of them. But if in case you guys have to drop off or something, we'll get back to you for sure. So keep coming, keep your questions coming. Next question is from Prashant Shetty. Love this question, which is, as a tech recruiter, during the intro call / discovery call, how to check the cultural fitment of a candidate? What type of questions we can ask?
Interesting question, actually. When it comes to leadership hiring, the only thing I'll tell you is, these are seasoned folks. So you need to figure out the noise to signal ratio. I think you should get better at that. So questions, I stay away from asking very hypothetical questions, what if situations, and dwell more on real life examples. I think leadership hiring is about folks who have been in the system long enough. So instead of asking what if would you do if in a tough situation, I would say, have you been through a tough situation? Walk me through. I would say true characters show up in tougher situations than easier situations. Everybody can celebrate, but when shit hits the fan, it's very difficult, and that's where true traits show up. So I tailor my questions in the intro call more around real life examples and asking them to walk me through examples which I can probe further versus asking hypothetical questions. That is one. Second is, I use the same yardstick when I talk to multiple people. For example, you can't ask 10 different sort of questions with 3 different candidates and walk away with 30 data points that are no correlation to each other. You understand what the role requires. If the role is to build, if the role is to scale, if the role is to do 0 to 1, based on that, I would look for proxies in the questions that I ask for. Yeah. I know I got very tactical, but think of it again in a framework. Think of it again in a more structured way. Write down your questions. Don't wing it. Yeah.
Anil, just to build on to this, we had very recently gone to Saudi Arabia for a separate session. But over there, we found some great insights. Again, talent hiring was one of the biggest challenges that even Saudi Arabia ecosystem, as they are opening up, was facing. But for them, they said that apart from the typical interview process, they've started introducing many other things in the hiring process. For example, putting case studies, which I'm sure many of the startups as well do. But they've gone beyond doing actually on-the-job evaluation. So they're giving live projects to a candidate who he or she is expected to work on while he or she may be employed with the other company. Now, I don't know the legalities of it from an Indian context, but all I'm saying is people are testing the limits and boundaries of evaluating a candidate before joining, because the cost of a bad hire is very, very high. So, throw everything at it within the legal bounds, as long as you're able to gauge the right things from the candidates.
Yeah, next question we have from Prabhanjan Kulkarni. His question is, first of all, he says, kudos to bring the session together, Anil, Praveen, Abhijit. Then his query is, in growth stage startups, the incumbent leader would be playing multiple roles. And at the time of hiring replacement, the demand or need would be to find an equal. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, there's only one Sachin Tendulkar, right? So it's that kind of a question, right? So look, I think this is a dilemma that we often come across. It's not new. It's not what we are expecting is for somebody with context, for somebody outside to match the context that somebody inside has to play those multiple roles. I've often gone back to leaders and we've gone to the drawing board to, for example, write down all of the responsibility of this person leaving, for example, right? And if there are 5 things that they're doing, what are the absolute must-haves out of those 5? Which meant that those are the skills that we look for. And the remaining 3, it's a great growth opportunity for other leaders. So the reason I make this point is it's not just about, as TA leaders, it's not just about going there and getting candidates from outside, but I think this is also a coaching moment that we can take to help coach the leaders. Sometimes, there's this racehorse blinders that are on that, someone's leaving, let's get someone, things are breaking and so it just helps them to kind of widen their view a bit by bringing more clarity into what is it that they're asking and why is it that they're asking. Most often than not, if somebody's doing this, it's because they've had a lot of context. They've been in the system long enough, and that's why they've been able to do this. I think it's just unfair to expect that from a new incumbent to come in and do all of those 5 things at the same time. Yeah, he or she might do it at some point, but not initially. But just writing it down has helped. I think that's what's helped me in situations like this, is to have a must-have versus what are things that can be looked at, let's say 3 to 6 months from now, and get other leaders to step into that as well. So I use this as a more coaching moment rather than just a hiring moment. Make sense? Abhijit, you've been on the other side of this, so you should add if there's any other
No,
views that you have.
100% right. I don't want to add anything else because you've perfectly nailed it.
Cool. Next question from Prashant. As a recruiter, how do you win the debriefs if no one else bats for that candidate in the room? I mean, what data points should we gather before we get into the meeting?
I'll take this. So, Prashant, I don't think it's about winning or losing. If to start with, the interview process was anchored in testing the right competencies by a different panel. Yeah. So if there is a panel of 4, each one has a very clear role to play. Somebody's testing functional experience, somebody's testing some specific competencies. If they've done their job well and then captured that conversation really well. So in X210X, we use a very simple debrief framework, and for every person, we tell him or her the competencies that he or she is supposed to be interviewing this candidate for, capture the insight which are more data driven versus just emotions and subjective in nature, and give a rating on a scale of 1 to 4. We've purposely kept no 3 in the rating because people would love to be on the fence because they don't want to have a clear opinion. 1 is not to hire at all. 4 is like, I can't do without this guy in my company. 2 and 3 is where he's either missing some competencies or over-indexing on some and missing on a few. And your entire discussion should be around this. And if 2 people have measured the same competency and one has rated him a 2 and one's rated a 4, then go back to the data points as to why somebody's thought he's a 4 versus a 2. And again, when we say that the debrief quality has to be a very, very high order, it has to be first written, second needs to be quantified, third, there has to be a strong conversation and debate which is managed by somebody else who's possibly, because as a boss or as a founder or as the hiring manager, given the stress and the position that you have, you might just take over the discussion and the others may or may not have their points of view heard really well. So I don't think you should think about, I desperately want this candidate and somebody else is not liking it. It's important that you hear his or her point of view. Maybe he's found something that you have missed and his point of view is equally relevant. So follow the process to the T and you will automatically come up to the right conclusion.
Thanks, Abhijit. Next question is from Richa Bajaj. Folks will take maybe one or maybe the last couple of questions. I hope it's fine for the panelists also to extend a bit. Next question is from Richa. Question to Anil. Why is it important to ask culture fit question in the intro call? I believe it should be more on the sides of providing as much info about the company as we can, rather checking on this aspect. It's important to create an interest for us being a startup in the first call. Please suggest.
Okay. Yeah. So why is it important to have a culture fit? Look, I think the leadership hiring is a long process. It takes anywhere between 3 to 4 months to hire a leader. And I think anywhere between 18 to 20 hours worth of interviewing, right? From both sides. Now, put yourself in the leadership, just switch positions here. And if you were the leader, Richa, and if I would make the intro call telling you only about the company and not what we stand for, our cultures, what our culture and what we stand for and our values. And if you got to know of it, let's say 10 hours into the interview process and realize this is not what I want to sign up for, there is the opportunity cost of running that time and effort. You're taking away time from engineering, you're taking away time from multiple cross-functional teams. It just makes it so much better for both people on both ends of the phone to be clear. And it's like, I think of it as a handshake, right? You're telling everything you can about the company and what the company stands for. And the person on the other hand is saying, yes, this resonates with me. Here's a shake hand. Here's my hand. Let's shake hands. Let's get on to the process then, right? And I think the process is then more effective because I have been in multiple situations where we've got to this at the absolute end of it. And it's like a slap in the face saying, oh, what the hell were we doing? 20 hours of interviewing without realizing that this is not the candidate for us. So it's just important to place all your cards on the table, at least on these fronts, intro, culture, all of it. These are all absolutely must-have table stakes for me. You need to have these cards out and let the person decide whether they want to further engage or not. And if you're being authentic about it, most often than not, they would at least want to hear what you have to say. Yeah. And that's why it's so much.
Anil, I can't tell you the amount of times we've got a person wrong.
Yeah.
Not because of any other issue, but just because it's a culture misfit.
True. True.
So putting the culture upfront, and quick example from one of the companies that we were hiring for. That company had a 6-day working compared to many other startups who are now 5-day working, which is like itself a big barrier for others to join in, right? And especially in the tech team, people are used to working 5 days versus this company, clear 6-day policy of working.
Yeah.
They would lay this out upfront. Second, the leadership team was expected to go to a remote town where most of the action was supposed to happen. So they would ask the candidates not to get interviewed in Bangalore, but they would make that guy travel 4 hours by road into that town where the main business was being operated.
Right.
Now, if this is a culture shock for this candidate, he better opt out before than later.
Yeah.
Showing
Absolutely.
all of this later, showing only the living room in the beginning and then showing a dirty kitchen is recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. Yeah. Spot on. Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Cool, folks. We'll take this as the last question. The last question is, how good is it to take the retainer path for leadership hiring with an external vendor?
Praveen, take this one.
Yeah, Anil being on the other side of the table will agree to me, but there is tremendous amount of effort and time that goes in investing in the entire process of recruiting, right? And that starts from researching on candidates, researching on candidate cohort pools, identifying where, and like Anil says, sourcing is available. Sourcing, I mean, candidates are available today, but even then, you need to identify them and initiate conversations and get them to the table, right? Now, unfortunately, in many cases, because most of the engagements are success driven, and it's long drawn, leading to in cases where in the recent past we have seen that positions get dropped off the list of hiring. That effort and time gets wasted on the partners front, and that's the only reason why this retainer helps them to at least keep that P&L going, and that's the reason for the retainers being asked, and which is adjustable against the final success any which ways, right? I think as a partner, the investment is in terms of making sure that the role is closed for the client, because that's where the impact actually lies. Now, in part to that, there are resources required, there are time and effort that is spent, which needs to be quantified and paid for at some point. And that's what helps the partners with the retainers.
I will just add to this.
It also brings the skin in the game from a client perspective too.
And I think that's the most important point as well, Praveen, because if a company is willing to pay the retainer, it just tells you that their intent to hire is very, very high, and it's a serious hire versus just scouting the market and wasting everybody else's time. So for me, it's not so much about just the efforts being compensated. Yes, they should be compensated. It just tells you how serious is this company for the position that is being hired for. I think with this, Adi, I'm assuming that while there's many more questions which are unanswered, we will get back to people with some way of responding to their questions. But we've run out of time. We've actually taken almost 11 more minutes beyond the scheduled time. So I would like to conclude today's session by, number one, thanking my co-participants, Anil and Praveen, for joining and bringing your experience to this very, very important topic. Adi, thanks for organizing this and helping all the administrative piece, and more importantly to all the participants who registered, taken their time out on a Friday afternoon and been patient with all the questions and our input. So thank you so much, guys. If there's any questions that you feel are still unanswered, you would want to talk to any one of us, please write to Adi and we'll figure out a way to respond back to you either in person or a call. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you for joining the call. Thank you, Abhijit, for having us. Thank you.
Thanks. Absolutely. Loved it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.